Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to be addressing the question of what is Africa and where is Africa? Africa is a very interesting place, as you can see, based upon the previous video talking about the Indian Ocean Islands and the people from there. But perhaps more than any other place name in history and in terms of geopolitical spaces, this particular space, this particular name has owned and shared many iterations in terms of its geographical boundaries and in terms of its actual place name. And so we're going to look at these place names, and we're going to see that these names touch on issues from geography to politics to religion to mythology to history. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at these names, we're going to look at some of their meanings and their origins to get a better understanding of who, what, and where is Africa. Hopefully this will help you with your research when you come across names, particularly in antiquity, and you don't know where these names come from. You might find that some of these names that you had no idea might be related to Africa is really Africa. And for those who learn best by using scriptural references, we're going to incorporate some scriptural references. And one of the things that you're going to note as we get into this discussion is that the entire Bible is perhaps all about Africa. In current times, most people are used to thinking about Africa in terms of the geographic boundaries that are on the map. And so people are pretty much used to hearing these place names and understanding Africa in terms of all of those varieties of colors on this map, and pretty much excluding other things from Africa. But again, as we can see from the video on the Indian Ocean, the boundaries of Africa are pretty vast, and we're going to dig into that. And one of the things that we see from some writings in the 1700s, 1717, is that Africa was understood as this vast expanse of area. And it went by several ancient names that many people perhaps have no idea that Africa went by. And so again, in terms of your research, this should be very helpful in identifying some of these places and understanding that Africa's identity has been significantly broader than perhaps we've been led to believe. And so we have Olympia. Africa was known in ancient times as Olympia, as Amonis, Ortygia, and Afer. And that particular place name is purportedly related to a nephew of Abraham in terms of the Bible. And here in a writing to King Charles II from John Ogilby Esquire, this is back in the 1600s, he is basically, actually there's a collection of entities that are describing Africa, and they are expounding on Africa, and they're researching Africa. And one of the things that is done in this writing to King Charles, or for King Charles, is they are expounding on the ancient names of Africa and explaining all of the iterations of Africa, all of the geographic boundaries of Africa that many people may have never known in terms of considering Africa. So there's this really myopic view that people have had of Africa over time, and it's really related to current history, and it doesn't often take into consideration very ancient history. And we're talking about, lots of BC history. And so a lot of people think like the names of Africa are more recent and have questions about, well, what were the older names? And people also have questions about, well, is Africa in the Bible? And there Because of some dynamics related to race and color, it's almost as if people want to write Africa out of the Bible. But again, when you look at this, you can see as we go through this that the Bible pretty much is about Africa in its expansive understanding. And so you can see Africa has gone by names from Olympia to Akibalon, to Cyrene, to Afer, related to Hercules. I mean, Libya. Africa has gone by so many iterations. Oceania, these are iterations that many people would have never guessed would be related to Africa. It's as if Africa has been this huge mystery throughout history. And here is a fairly comprehensive list that we have so far of the different names of Africa and the different geopolitical spaces that have been considered Africa. And one of the really interesting ones is Oceania, which is basically Australia and the Pacific ecozone, which includes Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And so this might answer a lot of questions that people have had about the possibility of, for instance, Black Americans perhaps coming from these islands. And when you have everything being called Africa, anything is possible. And particularly when you're talking about things like earthquakes and, volcanic action, separating spaces and recreating spaces. It's very interesting to look at how all of these names may have manifested and how Africa has been understood differently throughout time. And so it really takes having an open mind to really entertain all of the facts of history and to put them together to hopefully come to some semblance of truth. And here we have a writer talking about the dimensions of Africa in antiquity. And we also have some discussion of the historical understanding of how the earth has been divided and who has been located on what parts of the earth. One of the interesting things to note is that Africa, Asia, and Europe have historically been understood as one geographic space and really separated based upon, as you'll note up there, based upon an earthquake and related to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And so in looking up the etymology of the word earthquake, it goes all the way back to, I think it was the 13th century. And so there had to be something that took place back then for them to come up with this idea of this word earthquake. And so something must have taken place. And so it would be interesting to know if that is when a number of these breakups and these rifts occurred and some of the drifting away of the different spaces in terms of Earth. And so one of the very interesting things is that the different continents were thought of as islands, these huge islands. And so, Europe, Africa, and Asia being one, America being another, and then the other space, which apparently is Australia. One of the things we see here with Ortygia is the fact that Africa was also identified as Greece, also identified as Sicily, also identified as Rome. And so Africa has been really vast in terms of this identity. And you can see that the name of Africa was used in very early times. So we're looking at 146 BC, and it was known as Africa Proconsularis. Okay, it was a Roman province. And then interestingly, here's the dictionary definition relating to the Greek island of Delos, held in antiquity to be the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. And as indicated in the writing for King Charles, there are biblical roots and biblical heritage in terms of the identity of Africa. And so Africa is related to this word affair, and it's spelled a couple of different ways. And so we'll look at that. And that, if you're looking for that, it's in Strong's 0665. And you can also hear the way that it's pronounced. And so that comes from the word, the definition of ashes. Also, interestingly, with all of its vast resources, is also related to this construct of worthlessness. And so also related to a word origin of bestrew. And here you get to see some of the locations and more dictionary definitions of this affair, and you can see other things that it is related to. Again, related to Abraham and his wife Keturah, also related to Ezra, descended from the tribe of Judah. So you've got a relationship to Manasseh. So there's a lot of stuff going on in relation to affair and its understanding as Africa. And here at Strong's 0666, you see affair, and it means covering or bandage. And if you do some research on this, you will find that many Arabic travelers often referred to it as covering or bandage, and again, also ashes. And those of you who are familiar with ancient Rome, again, we have Africa related to Ephesus, which in contrast to ashes, relating to that which is desirable. And so also related to the word Ortygia, or the place name Ortygia. And this place name is related to an Asiatic goddess and the temple known as for Artemis. And so again, you can see that there is a lot going on in terms of the history of Africa. And a lot of this history has been obscured, and it's perhaps been obscured because of racial issues and the connotation of Africa as being a quote unquote black space. And so perhaps a lot of Africa's history has been misconstrued and pretty much ignored. And what happens, of course, when history doesn't fit with what we want it to fit with, we will miss out on an opportunity to understand the facts of a situation and to get to truth, particularly as you're doing your research. If all of these names are constantly changing, it's kind of difficult for you to figure out where your ancestors came from. You know, what's the historical narrative about where your ancestors came from? And given the fact that in keeping with Enjodica, the notion that everyone in one way, shape, form, or fashion is descended from Africa, it's very important that people understand the totality of the history of the space or spaces that have been historically known as Africa. And here we have a German translation about Africa and the way that they are pronouncing it. And one of the things that they're relating Africa to is Jupiter. And you can see related to the priests of Jupiter, Ammon, and also related to Libya and Hannibal. And so you can see that there's a lot going on in terms of the understanding of Africa, and the fact that so many languages and so many cultures have names for Africa and have understandings of Africa through antiquity. And here again, we have Africa as Greece and known as Hellas. And this is now understood as a part of Europe, distinct from Africa. And Hellas has roots in Hellenic, so Greece and Hellenic history. And again, you can see here some scriptural references related to Greece and Hellas to give you a better understanding. You can see some instances where this was mentioned in different scriptures, starting with Daniel, and you have Zechariah and Acts. And so again, you have Africa clearly now understood as Greece also appearing in various places in Scripture. And Africa is also related to Syracuse. And so, again, related to the coast of Sicily. And this pretty much follows that, saying about where Africa actually begins, and saying that it begins in Europe. And so some people might have just thought that that was some sort of saying, but clearly there was this understanding that Africa was much larger and incorporated much more than what we think of today. And what we see here is that, we see this, you see this island, this what looks like an island there, and it's really a part of the Roman province of Sicily. And so you have all of this perhaps confusion because there is a lot of conflating with what people know today as Rome and what people know today as Sicily and what people know today as Africa. And so because of the conflating in the past and then the separation of it in present times, it's very confusing trying to understand for many people how Africa fits in terms of ancient history. And so again, that history is much broader, and those geographic spaces are much broader than many people may have entertained in the past. And here we have a discussion about Olympia, that other name by which Africa has been known. And so there's some discussion about the geology of it. There's some more discussion about, Greece in general. And so you can see that, again, it's even talking about Thebes. So there's, talking about Zeus and talking about Egypt. And so there is this incorporation of much more than people have been entertaining about Africa. And so people really need to get past all of that confirmation bias that, again, is somewhat related to Nordicism that we've been talking about. And once people are able to get past that Nordicism bias and also that melanism bias, because a lot of people not only have notions about Africa that create a limiting focus, they have a lot of notions about Africa that are Nordic. And then you have other people that have notions about Africa that are completely related to melanin. And so what that means is that people miss the opportunity to understand the totality of Africa. They miss the opportunity to understand the totality of the people that have been included in terms of the identity of Africa, in terms of the geopolitics of Africa throughout history. And so again, Africa is not limited to any cultural groups, narcissistic interpretations of what Africa has been throughout time. Africa has historically been repeatedly sliced up like a piece of pie. And this understanding might give a better sense of why so many people seem to think that they should have their hands in the pie that is known as Africa. If you don't know who you are, you may not know who you are not. And if you don't know where you came from, you might not have a clear sense of where you are going. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.